Hello, this is Independence Square in Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia. But what if I told you that these buildings were not built to represent Malay culture at all? In fact, they were a part of a British colonial experiment. If you ever been in Kuala Lumpur, you probably saw an architectural ensemble near Merdeka Square. Sultan Abdul Samad Building. Next to that is National Textile Museum. On the other side is former Supreme Court of Kuala Lumpur. Not only them, but a lot of British government buildings in Kuala Lumpur have the similar style of architecture. All of them were built around 1890s by colonial British government. If you are not familiar with Malay culture, you might probably say that, well, this is somewhat of an Islamic architecture style, and since Malaysia is one of the biggest Muslim countries, it is not a coincidence that British used a style that was familiar to the local population. Well, you have to appeal to the masses. But the style was in fact not familiar to local population at all. If we look deeper in Malay culture, we will see that the average traditional mosque of Malay people looks like this. The design is very common for Malaysia, since this region has massive rainy seasons that can flood the whole cities for days. So the roof is triangular in shape for better water drainage, and like any other traditional houses of that region, the floor is raised above the ground in case of the flooding. Now if we compare them side by side, we won't see any functional ideas of using the style that the British have chosen. So the question arises, what motivated British people to use a style that was neither British nor Malay but was traditionally Indian? Well, actually it was rather British. The style is called Indo-Saracenic. It was an architectural style developed by the British in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, primarily in colonial India, but later extended to other parts of the empire. The style blended elements of traditional Mughal and Rajput architecture, such as domes, pointed arches, intricate jali screens, and minarets, with European neoclassical and Gothic influences. The result was an eclectic mix that retained the grandeur and ornamentation of Indian architecture while incorporating the symmetry and structural principles of Western design. At its core, Indo-Saracenic was not merely an aesthetic choice, but a statement of power and cultural dominance. The British government saw it as a way to assert control while simultaneously appealing to local sensibilities, or at least their perception of them. We can rightfully think that the British government considered it as a form of a trophy, a visual representation of their conquest and rule over India. By adopting and modifying the architectural language of the Mughal Empire, they were, in a way, laying claim to its legacy. The fusion of Eastern exoticism and European aesthetic principles quickly became a trend in colonial architecture. Grand public buildings, government offices, railway stations, and even palaces were constructed in this style, reinforcing the presence and authority of the British. It was not limited to India alone. Indo-Saracenic buildings can be found in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Malaysia, as the British carried this architectural approach across the empire. Some notable examples include Victoria Memorial in Kolkata, Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus in Mumbai, and the Sultan Abdul Samad Building in Kuala Lumpur. This shows what impression the monuments of the Mughal era made on the British, but it can also be seen as an example of the Orientalist thinking of the colonizers. The concept of Orientalism is a separate large topic for another video. Now we can briefly highlight its specific aspect of appropriation and shifting onto oneself a subordinate culture. Nowadays, it is difficult to deeply explore the mindset of colonizers because contemporary media portrays them as an absolute evil. This is not to say that they did nothing wrong, but rather their motivations were more complex. Of course, we could argue that they simply appropriated the style, transformed it to better suit their needs, and then used it everywhere. However, it is also important to recognize that the so-called colony influenced the colonizers' minds as well. The British did not adopt the style merely because the region had become part of the empire. They were genuinely impressed by the Indian culture and wanted to be some part of it too. Sometimes it is hard to understand and accept it, and I am nowhere near to defend cultural appropriation. But at the same time, it could be considered somewhat of a psychological fact. But pushing aside the question of their innocence remains one detail that was briefly mentioned in the beginning. The style was heavily used in Malaysia, and yes, the main reason for that was that Malaysia is predominantly Muslim. Now, it is not a fact of cultural appropriation no more, it's somehow even worse. Transferring of one subordinate culture to another based on their small similarity in faith? They did not pick up the Malay style in the same way as the Indian one. They just applied the already developed Indo-Saracenic style. Why? Most likely because the British saw the Islamic world as something solid, ignoring any forms of its individuality. When they discovered that there were a lot of Muslims living in Malaysia, the puzzle came together and oh, I have just what I need, they thought. Still, it is a collective image of the mysterious East and the majestic Islam which was more important to them than the real culture of the people. Following that logic, we can say that British started trying to replace the image of Islam for Malay people. Appealing to their dominant position, they seem to be trying to show what real Muslim buildings should look like. Fortunately, it was not successful. Nowadays, Malaysia not only builds masjids in traditional for them styles, but also can be considered as one of the leaders of modern masjid architecture. As of Independence Square's ensemble and many other colonial buildings, Malaysia successfully started to consider them as a part of the country's cultural and historical heritage. So the whole British experiment fortunately failed. Keeping that in mind, I don't think that today we should look at these once colonial government buildings as just monuments to the brutal humiliation of subjugated cultures, but rather as monuments to the evil joke of the identity of the colonizers themselves. So next time you walk past a colonial building, ask yourself, whose identity does it really reflect? But what do you think? How should we consider this type of buildings? Can we consider such buildings as a symbol of colonial oppression? Or have they become part of the architectural heritage of independent countries? I really hope to see what you think down in the comments, and if you are interested in this type of facts in history, please leave a like and follow.